stop slipping, and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
If these came out 8, even 5 years ago, people would be losing their minds. And that's because the modern football boot industry has become all about what's trending. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Adidas Predator 25 Elite Laceless, which, as the name would suggest, is the version of the new Predator sans laces. Where if we go back to 2016 when Adidas dropped the Ace 16 Plus Pure Control, or even to 2018 when they dropped perhaps the worst name for a pair of football boots of all time in the return of the Predator in the Predator 18 Plus, had this been what they put out at that time, I think the reception for the Predator would have been absolutely crazy. But it's not 2018, it's late 2024, where instead of being obsessed with laceless boots, everybody can't get enough of fold-over flap tongues that do absolutely nothing for overall performance, but they do look quite cool, which is why the tongueless and laceless Predator 25 has kind of flown under the radar. It sees many of the same updates as the rest of the Pred 25 Elites. However, it does also make some changes from the boot that this replaces directly in the Predator 24 Elite Laceless, but does maintain the same $260 retail price. So given that these are nowhere near as trendy as the FT variation, and given that they've seen next to no marketing attention from Adidas, does that mean that you shouldn't care about the laceless Predator 25? Well, maybe or maybe not. That's kind of what I want to talk about in today's video, because while it sounds crazy to say that a Predator 25, the most hyped up boot on the market right now, can be underrated, of all the top-end variants, the laceless model might just be the best kept secret. Even though it's not a secret, it just doesn't have a tongue. So if you want to learn more about these, including how they compare to last year's version, and of course how they fit and feel on feet, please stick around. We're going to go over all the details. And if you are by chance interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you enjoy the brutally honest, no-nonsense approach to these reviews, actual opinions, don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots as we head into 2025. So first things first, I want to address something that a lot of people are not addressing as it relates to the Predator 25, and that is the fact that this is much more of a refresh than it is an entirely new pair of football boots. Because if we grab the boot that it replaces directly and look at them side by side, you can see there are some subtle differences, but by and large, these are pretty well the same in almost every way. Where, don't get me wrong, there are some differences, although all of the changes I would say are relatively small. In other words, if you already have these and you really like them and they don't necessarily need replacing, don't feel like you have to run out and buy the Predator 25, because it is largely still going to offer a very similar experience. Where if we take a look at the upper, you are of course going to see the new graphics, which I do think look very good. I'd argue it's an improvement, but cosmetics ultimately have nothing to do with overall performance. The material of the upper is still Hybrid Touch 2.0. The finish on the surface is kind of a matte finish, but it has a little bit of like a soft touch to it, providing some grip on the ball, basically making it so it's not slippery, but not necessarily sticky either. Something we saw quite a bit of variation of with the Predator 24 was texture on the surface of the upper from colorway to colorway. So far, we only have this launch champagne red and black color, so we'll see if that continues to be the case with the Predator 25, but for the most part, on this particular pair at least, I really do like this finish. It feels quite nice. As far as the Hybrid Touch itself is concerned though, it's still very thin. There is an argument to be made that it is a smidge thinner than the previous variation, but in terms of touch on the ball, it's almost impossible to tell a difference. It's still, however, a very thin upper in general, where I think one of the big misconceptions with these modern Predators is that the expectation is that they're going to feel like an old school Pred. Not the case at all. If anything, I would describe the touch on the ball with these boots as having more of a barefoot feel rather than a padded one. So if you're not a fan of thin boots, then I don't necessarily think any of the current Predators are a great choice. It does feel nice. The material has good structure to it. So there's a solidness to this football boot when it is on your feet. But certainly if you get stepped on, there's just no real padding to this material. Which brings us to the strike skin rubber elements. Perhaps the biggest change coming from Predator 24, where you can see there's a lot less rubber and generally it's more streamlined. The end result is actually less grip on the ball, particularly noticeable when dribbling, I found, but still plenty of grip when shooting. It also makes for a slightly thinner feel in that there's just less material across the top of your foot. And you can see it still has those fins when you look in this direction that are still super flexible and grip the ball really, really nicely. But again, there's just less of them than what the 24 had. So if you liked having as much grip as possible and maybe a little bit of extra, I don't know that bulk is necessarily the word, but having that extra material in the striking area of the foot, then maybe the Predator 24 is your preference. Whereas if you found that you would like them to feel a little bit thinner and just have less grip on the ball, particularly when dribbling, you'll probably prefer this new variation like myself. What is disappointing though, particularly as it relates to the laceless variation of the new Predator 25, is that the strike skin element on this boot is exactly the same as it would be on the two laced variations, whereas on the Predator 24, because of the laceless construction, they took advantage of that extra real estate that they gained by eliminating a laceless system and added this little element right here and then one extra fin right here. So technically on the laceless Predator 24, there are more rubber elements on the physical upper than the two laced variations. Obviously, the difference is extremely minimal to the point where it really doesn't make a difference at all. But the fact that they haven't capitalized on at least some of this extra real estate with the new model is a little bit disappointing. Speaking of the laceless system, there's a change here, but it's not one that I would say is overly meaningful. And that you can see the laceless system is still made up of this elasticated prime knit material that creates this one-piece enclosure. It's the only one-piece upper variation you're going to find from all the top-end Predator Elite models. However, if you look at it side by side with last year's Predator 24, you can see the shape of that elasticated opening is a little bit different, but for the most part, it ends up feeling exactly the same on feet and providing the exact same amount of lockdown. There's a subtle change to the shaping, but that ultimately has nothing to do with the laceless system. At the end of the day, it's about as simple a laceless system you're going to find, where they're really relying on the structure of this hybrid touch material to basically hold your foot in place with this particular design. The only reason why you have this elasticated material on the top is to allow your foot to get in and out of the football boots, which is still relatively tricky in the sense that this material doesn't actually have a ton of stretch. I don't want to say that it's impossibly difficult, but they are a little bit trickier to put on than the laced alternatives. If you want to believe that removing the laces makes for a cleaner touch on the ball that's going to improve your performance, be my guest. I'm personally a little bit skeptical of that. I don't think this makes for any real difference in terms of touch or control. What does make a difference though is the ability to adjust your boots to the point where they fit you as well as they possibly can and also hold your feet in place, which is critical both when it comes to comfort as well as overall performance. Over time, I just feel like people have kind of realized that sometimes having laces is actually the better way to go. And by sometimes, I mean almost always. From here on out, almost everything else is pretty much the same as last year. It's still a low-cut construction with this little extension piece up the back. If you look at the heel liner, it's still a microfiber lining material with those two separated kind of heel bumps running along the side of the ankle to the back of the heel. Notice the spacing between the two bumps at the very back. They're now slightly further apart than they were with the previous generation, which, you guessed it, makes for absolutely no noticeable difference whatsoever. Personally, I would like there to be a little bit of extra padding back here, particularly for the laceless model, where because you don't have a lacing system to push your heel down and back when you pull the laces tight, this does apply a little bit more pressure to the back of your heel, which in turn makes them, in my opinion, the least comfortable variation of all the top-end Predator 25 Elites. But again, we'll talk about that more during the on-feet portion of the video. And then the insole, fully removable, I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It features a pretty standard mesh liner on the surface, and it's made from a single layer of white foam, pretty much the standard top-end Adidas football boot insole you'll get with almost everything from them. And then as for the base, it is the exact same control frame 2.0 introduced on the previous generation. You still get that external heel counter. It's still made from a relatively solid feeling plastic sole plate. It has good flexibility through the forefoot, but still feels nice and solid through the midfoot and heel, with what is now a traditional Adidas stud pattern at this point, featuring all triangular studs all the way through, where again, if you've worn an Adidas football boot in the last 10 to 12 years, you kind of know what to expect here. It's solid overall traction, but certainly not a standout compared to some other football boots. And then when it comes to weight, with the laced models, we actually saw that the new 25s have shaved a couple grams from the 24s, despite being so similar. We're of course going to see if that's the case with the laceless variations. New pair versus old pair, no laces to be found, both in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the 24s, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.1 ounces, the equivalent of 201 grams. Very lightweight. Did I mention that last year's laceless Pred was the lightest of the top end variations? Here's the new 25, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.9 ounces, the equivalent of 195 grams. Whereas you can see, the new laceless Predator is also about 5 or 6 grams than last year's variation, making it too the lightest of the top-end Elite Predator 25s, and actually only about 6 or 7 grams off of an F50 Elite, which of course is their dedicated speed boot. In other words, these are a lot lighter than you might expect them to be. On feet, just like last year's model, I do think the Predator 25 laceless does fit quite well. It's also going to be the tightest feel out of all the Predator models, in the sense that through the midfoot, because of this elasticated prime knit, it does have a little bit of a lower volume shaping because of that one-piece upper construction that does ultimately squeeze your foot relatively tight. Having said that, when force is applied, that material does stretch, which means that your heel isn't as locked in as it could be, and you lose out on all adjustability, particularly in the upper part of the forefoot area, where of course the benefit is that it's just free of any obstruction. You just have a clean feel of pure hybrid touch and nothing else. But if you do find that you like to have a more customized fit from your football boots, and in general just prefer more stability, more lockdown, which also typically results in better overall comfort, you are likely better off going for a laced variation. However, if you've been wearing laceless boots and you really like them, I do think this is definitely one of the better fitting options that they've ever made, or at least on par with what last year's laceless Pred was. Speaking of which, if I had to say that there was any significant difference between last year's versus this year's, they have increased the volume slightly through the forefoot and toe box area. There's just a little bit of extra width as well, but it is a very subtle change given that this football boot is still sitting on top of the same sole plate. So from a width perspective, if you have wide feet, laceless boots in general probably aren't a great idea, but this is definitely a pair of football boots that for wide footers in particular would not be a great overall choice. If you like laceless boots and you have regular to narrow width feet though, I think these should fit you. Whether or not they'll fit you exactly the way that you'd like, you really won't know that until you get them on feet. due to their lack of adjustability. As far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair, I would recommend going true to size. However, again, with any laceless football boot, if you're somebody that likes to wear your boots a little bit longer just because you like having that extra breathing room, or perhaps you want that little bit of room to grow if that's still happening for you, I definitely don't think that laceless boots are a great choice. Again, just because you don't have that option to make them fit a little bit tighter on your feet. If you're buying laceless boots, whether it's these or any other ones, get them to fit as snug as possible, because that's the only way you're going to get them to fit properly and ultimately perform to the best of their abilities when it comes to actually playing in them. Laceless boots that are too big is just a bad idea. So in conclusion, if you really liked last year's Laceless Predator 24 Elite, I think you will also really like this year's Predator 25 Elite. Does that mean that you should run out and upgrade? Probably not, just given that the difference is so minimal. But overall, especially being somebody that does prefer having a little bit less grip, particularly when dribbling, I do prefer the new one over the old one. As for whether or not the laceless version is the best version of the Predator 25 Elites, I personally think the simple answer to that question for the vast majority is a straight up no. Where as far as laceless boots go, I do actually think they fit very well. I don't personally find them as comfortable as the laceless F50 Elites, but if you really like laceless boots and you've been wearing them for the last several years, I don't foresee you having any major issues with discomfort when it comes to this new Predator 25. If you're trying to just get into laceless boots for the first time, however, do realize that you lose out on adjustability, and while we are seeing more and more pro adoption of laceless football boots, Lamine Yamal obviously being a very big name repping laceless football boots, you also have to consider that pros are wearing made-to-measure football boots, where in that particular situation, not having the laces isn't going to be quite as big a deal. Whereas if your foot shape doesn't work all that well with the shape of this particular football boot, you're likely just never going to have a great fit or a great experience, or at least as good of an experience as you could have with basically the same football boot with some laces, which is just the Predator 25 Elite that you can get for the exact same price, which also don't have a tongue, which means you probably want the FT version. If you really want a laceless Predator, I think these are great, but if you just want the best laceless boot you can get right now, I would personally lean a little bit more towards the F50 Elite laceless, but that's just me.